Contribution from Ben, and then we'll open up the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Danny. Well, I'm Ben Duncan. I'm one of the Green councillors here in Brighton and Hove. Before I start, I've got some numbers and facts and figures and stuff, but I just want to thank everyone for coming today, and particularly George. That was really interesting, and it's great to see so many people from the Greens and from other parties and from Brighton, Women Against the Cuts, and from the People's Assembly. It really feels like there's a lot of people in this city, and a lot of them are in this room, who really want to see something quite different than the same old politics as usual, led by what is, let's face it, government cuts. But I want to just get into some numbers. The other thing I'll quickly say is I voted against the cuts budget last year as well. I'm delighted that I wasn't expelled from the Green Party, and I'm really proud actually to be part of a party that not only lets people voting in other ways, but come to meetings like this and say things which might be controversial within a party framework. It's the freedom to have different views towards the ultimate shared vision that makes me so glad to the Greens. But anyway, some facts and figures, and I'll be as quick as I can because I realise everyone probably wants to speak. Basically, the total national budget for local government is about £70 billion a year. It's about a quarter of all public spending in the country is done by local councils. There are about 470 councils around the country who are doing that, and they provide all sorts of services, not just kind of schools and refuse collection, but they maintain parks and libraries and all this other sort of stuff. That's what they do with the 70 billion. About 2 million people around the country are directly employed by local government. It's one of the biggest sectors, employment sectors in the country. And I think we have to remember when we're thinking about services and budgets, about the jobs and how many people are employed in this sector. And it's those jobs that cuts will ultimately affect, and we have to think about that too. Since the current government came to power in 2010, there's been about a 10% a year reduction in these budgets, roughly, around the country, not always evenly. Some have seen a bit more than 10% a year, some a bit less, but it's about that. We've seen 400,000 local government employees lose their jobs since 2010. There are 400,000 people who used to work for local councils just 3 years ago who no longer do. That's the reality of what we're facing here. We heard from George what Albert Ball said, that it's the end of local government as we know it. Well, I mean, with his permission, I'll quote David Jones, who's here today, who's the Green Party parliamentary candidate for Brighton Kent Town. He said he thought it actually goes a bit further. It's an attack on democracy itself. Because let's remember, all these services are services which are delivered according to democratic choices. We've heard our councillors haven't got much power, but they're the best we've got in terms of a local democratic way of deciding what local priorities for public services are. And we're seeing that attacked, and we're seeing their influence even more reduced. Now, it's not just because I'm a councillor I don't like that, I'm a Democrat, and that's why I don't like it. That's the national picture. A few words about Brighton and Hove's budget, and as Danny said, all the proposals have been published in full now on the council's website. I haven't drawn them up, I had a hand in drawing them up myself, so I can't be really specific about the proposals down to the last line, but it's all available, and I'll certainly answer any questions I can about any of that. But in a nutshell, the council budget in Brighton and Hove is about 775 million a year. Now, about roughly half of that is taken up with direct grants for schools and through the rents collected for the thousands of people living in council houses and the housing budget, which comes from central government. So that 775 is actually about half that, about 400 million that we've got locally to play with, but we can make any decisions about at all. Now, of that, about 36%, these are all the local figures, and forgive me for reading them because they're, detailed to remember, but about 36% of that 400 million comes directly from government grants. About 32% of it from fees and charges, the majority things to do related to parking, but also fees for entry to the museum and the pavilion and so on. Not the museum, that's free, isn't it? The pavilion has got substantial charges which contribute to that. 26% of that 400 million comes from council tax receipts. So only a quarter of half of the council's budget has got anything to do with council tax at all. About 10% of it comes from business rates. Now they're of course rates which are set nationally. We haven't really got control over the level of them. We have got some control over making decisions to give ourselves a thriving economy. It's all relative, of course, because everyone's in the doldrums, but the economy is doing relatively okay in Brighton and Hove compared to some places in the country. That gives us more money, but we're not really in control of it at all. So that's where the money comes from. And at the moment, we spend about 25 million of it on the refuse and rubbish collection services, recycling and street cleaning and all that kind of area. About 33 million on transport, and that includes the cost of all the free bus passes that the disabled and elderly use. Those costs, although they're decisions taken nationally, the costs are borne locally, and that's the bulk of the transport budget goes on that. We spend about £112 million a year on adult care. Majority of that is on employing people to deliver home care, care in people's homes for vulnerable elderly adults who just can't do the basic stuff of life. This is very staff intensive, it's very expensive, we spend an awful lot of money on it, but you know, it's important that we do, it's vitally important that we remember that this is a staff intensive job. Any reductions in that budget means a reduction in the number of staff or the way that those staff are remunerated. We spend about 67 million on all the things that aren't schools, because they're ring fenced, to do with children, things like looking after children, you know, foster care placements. This sort of stuff is very expensive, to the tune of about 67 million a year. We spend about 35 million on other things to do with housing that aren't from the housing rent sector, things like providing you know, emergency accommodation and things. 35 million a year spent on all of that. And there are loads of other bits and bobs. But, you know, I'm going to run out of time if I go into any more detail, so I'll stop with all that detail. What I will say is there are a number of pressures that the council faces, and these pressures amount to 26.5 million. I'm using the word pressures, there's loads of language around this stuff. Some people call it pressures, some people call them cuts, some people, which is probably the reality of what we're talking about. But the point is you can describe it in any way you like. We've got 26.3 million, it's now 23.6 million in terms of the amount of the budget that will be reduced next year. That's an awful lot of money from a budget with control of 400 million. Last year, the cuts were a little bit smaller. They were still enough that I felt I had to vote against the budget, essentially for one reason, that Eric Pickles and the Conservative government has repeatedly made the argument that local councils can manage on a little bit less. That has been a justification for cutting monies while pretending it doesn't affect real people's services and real jobs. Now, every council around the country that sets a budget according to whatever principles they've got that actually works, proves him right. They prove the Tories right everywhere in the country that manages to set a budget based on any reduction in government grant is basically saying to the Tories, well, you were right, we have too much money in the first place. But remember, this money is spent on those 2 million jobs a year. This money is spent on providing the services for the most vulnerable, not just here, but everywhere. I think to move on about what we do about this, because it's all very well one councillor or a couple of councillors voting against it, that doesn't really help. The point is the Green Party has developed a budget according to a set of really, really good principles. They said in a manifesto that they would develop a budget that protected as far as possible services for the most vulnerable. Now I think they've done that. You can argue about the extent to which they've done it 100% or 90%, but I think they've done it as far as possible, and if certainly that principle has been on the table around the discussions. There are a couple of other principles. Principle, for example, of fairness. Now we've seen, as part of these proposals, all staff for the council being paid the living wage of £7.65. No one will get less than that. We've seen increases in salary and in pension contributions according to national agreements, but we've adopted them. We've got a policy of not evicting anyone because they can't pay their rent because of the bedroom tax. Now this is pretty basic kind of social stuff, if you like, but it's all quite expensive, and these principles have gone into the way this budget is drawn up. There's also environmental principles. We've adopted the One Planet Living framework. We've managed to save an awful lot of carbon reductions being made from council buildings. We saved some cash along the way. Cash that is used to help preserve these jobs, pay the living wage and so on. I think, we've got to decide what to do, and I think this meeting will hopefully be able to give some feedback to the several councillors here, and I've seen probably about a quarter of the councils here when I look around the room, and it will give real feedback that's really useful, because what we need to do is to, going forward, either adopt the budget, get on with next year, we'll have arguments about particular lines in the budget, this cut or that cut, or to say, no, enough's enough, we're not going to do Eric Pickles' dirty work anymore. The economics, I think the budget that the Green Party's come up with is a really fantastic budget, but it's still a budget that has a total expenditure of 23.6 million than last year, and that for me is the principle. Very finally, I'll say that there are a number of options what we can do next, one of which will be just completely refusing to set the budget. Now this is in a way a well-trodden path, in a way a voyage of adventure, because since the law has changed, it has not happened anywhere in the country. We know what the law says, we don't know how it would necessarily be implemented and what it would really mean for people in this city. What we know, according to the law, is that if the council in February refuses to set a budget, they can't come to agreement. If, for example, this room feels they wants to, and is persuasive and get councillors or the majority of them to vote against the budget, that will mean the responsibility for passing it goes to the chief executive and the chief finance officer, unelected officials, both very well paid unelected officials. Now it has been argued that they would just exercise, they would come up with a budget by exercising a knife, they would have no principles about what they did next. I don't actually believe that. None of us really know, because we're talking about the future. I think, like all of us, if we're honest, very senior council officers probably like to take the path of least resistance most of the time. So I think with a budget on the table, the budget the Green Party has already drafted, they will look at it and think, well, officers have been working on this for months. Books balance according to this, so we're going to adopt this budget. We're going to have to. So that is hope, that is optimism, but it's also my belief, is that if the council refused to vote for a budget, we would actually get the budget on the table. Pretty much, and that's pretty much the best that can be done under the circumstances. Now, I would love it if we had an enormous pot of money and it was possible as councillors not only to vote for a no-cuts budget, but to go further, to spend more money on the vulnerable, to spend more money on the environmental project, more money on all the good things that many of us really agree on. Instead, I'm a bit nervous, and it's already happening, that I'll spend the next few months arguing with people I completely agree with over 15 grand there, 20 grand here, 25 grand there, and that to me kind of misses the point. The point is, do we start in Brighton and Hove a kind of a national argument about resisting by not setting council budgets? This happened in the 1980s. A lot of councils, notably Lambeth and Liverpool, refused to set budgets. Now you could say it didn't work. The councillors concerned got surcharged an awful lot of money. There were still budgets and they were pretty messy. People lived there. Another way of looking at it, you could say, well, the government, the Tory government under Margaret Thatcher, reformed the rates as a result of that. What did she come up with? The bloody poll tax. But what did that lead to? It led to Thatcher get kicked out on her arse. So you could say that actually worked. It worked in as much as it took a number of years. It didn't work immediately in those areas, but we were free of Thatcher as a result. That's one way of telling the story, and I like it. Maybe if there's a national resistance to local government cuts, spearheaded by the Greens of Brighton and Hove, that could actually mean that Cameron's out on his arse. I would love it if that happens.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Where's the chair?
So, limited contributions from the floor. People, please try and be brief and introduce yourself when you speak. Yes.
Alan Borgard.